Okay, thanks Declan, and thanks to UNSW for this opportunity to come and talk today. And yeah, really big thanks for the fact that, both Monash and UNSW are really linked in with this work we're doing on the User-Centered Energy Systems Technology Collaboration Program, which is part of this body called the International Energy Agency. So what I want to do today is to walk through some of the ways in which this thing we call the energy transition is actually reshaping not only the energy system, but in the process will, I think, necessarily end up reshaping the relationship between people and energy. And basically the core tenet of this is that we cannot successfully tackle these problems of climate change without completely changing the way we think about energy and the way it's structured. And that's by putting people at the center of the energy system. And I'm going to unpack that idea as we go through and talk a bit about the roles people play within the energy system, but also spin through some of the implications of this. And some of this is quite forward-looking and thinking about the trajectory that we may be on and how we might want to navigate between different choices as we go down this road. And also then tying it back towards some really concrete projects that we've been involved with, which kind of, I think, nicely illustrate some of the things that we will be collectively facing in this sector, but also that we're grappling with within this user-centered energy systems. So I think the first point is that when we think about energy users, we often start, I think particularly from an industry sector, with a kind of quite stereotypically narrow defined user in mind. And I think one of the really challenging elements in this sector is that we can't really start by making assumptions about our users. We have to actually start by going out and talking with people and wider users of the energy system, so we can try to capture some of the diversity of needs that arise. So, this photo just tickles me every time I see it, so I enjoy that. But it does go to show that the energy system is used in all sorts of curious ways that we don't think about from tackling it, if you like, from an energy systems perspective. We've tended to design it by sitting in the center and thinking, we need to provide energy, we will deliver a good, and people will be excited and grateful and engage with us in that process. And I think ultimately we get trapped by these kind of stereotypes. And so we need to reverse this and actually engage by going out and understanding how people use energy, and then reverse engineer that, do sort of user-centered design processes and work back to how we deliver what people want rather than what we think we want. And this will be a recurrent theme as we go through this. So I'm going to start with some big picture stuff, and I want to start by trying to describe how we think people are actually integral to the energy system. We're used to thinking of energy consumers at the end of the day being this, if you like, the thing to which we sell our end product. But that's decreasingly the case, and as we'll talk about here, when we think about the sort of disaggregation of the energy system, the move of generation out into PV and wind and battery storage, that is very much no longer the case. And so this diagram is trying to kind of tackle some of these things. And that top line is actually, that may ring some bells if anybody's been in the kind of physics community for a while. There's a classic quote in there that actually comes from Einstein's theory of relativity, which basically says mass tells space how to bend and space tells matter how to move. And there's an analogy here where basically with socio-technical systems, there is this interplay, this dynamic between what we as a society will permit the technology systems to do and how they can evolve, and simultaneously the suite of choices that are then presented to us in order that we choose from. So if we think about individual behavior in a kind of really practical way, you are often confronted with a choice of different energy technologies. So if we're thinking about heating or cooling our homes, we have choices of various types of air conditioning or heating systems. We could be choosing heat pumps. We could be choosing gas boilers. So we have a kind of suite of technical possibilities. And we have a set of preferences which are actually built up over time. So work that we've done in the UK is quite interesting. We're trying to decarbonise our heating sector at the domestic level. And the thing we've found is that we're really interested in heat pumps. Heat pumps are really big in parts of Europe. We would like more of them in the UK because they're efficient and we can electrify them. But your willingness to adopt a heat pump is very dependent on your previous experience of technology. So if you've had technologies which were old night storage electric resistive heaters, then heat pumps are fantastic. This is a wonderful new technology. But if you've had a condensing gas instant boiler, then heat pumps are these really clunky things with huge inertia. So we get locked into these historical technology development pathways, and they really shape what is possible. So we've got this kind of strange dynamic going because we have a set of preferences and there's wider social issues that govern those. These form individual behaviors which then aggregate up to form social structures around things like constructive social norms, where what we think everybody else do and how that influences our behavior. So they then kind of recirculate round and they define the things that are technically possible and what companies can actually develop and market. So we're in this kind of continuous loop of co-evolution between what we as a society will accept and the suite of technologies presented to us. So we need to think in that kind of terms, particularly now when we're trying to really rapidly change the global energy system. So we're moving into a very different kind of dynamic. If you're listening, we'll have some reference to things like Extinction Rebellion and the real sense that we need to decarbonize the system within the next 10, 20, 30 years. That is incredibly rapid rates of change when you've got pieces of technology that have lifespans of 10, 20, or 30 years. So we're in a really different world now, and this whole thing is speeding up like crazy, and we've got to somehow try and steer this through the process. So it's interesting times, but if we don't acknowledge that in fact we have this interplay between what we will permit and what we can choose, then we're in real trouble. So at a big level, that's kind of where we're at. Another way of tackling this, and this is a very famous equation called the Kaya identity, which some of you may be familiar with. It's quite big in things like the International Energy Agency. It's very kind of a sort of economic-y. But we can think about national energy as the product of three things. So we can think about the energy intensity. So that's really the efficiency bit. That's how much service we get out for each unit of energy we put in. So if you do something like insulate your home, then you stick the same amount of energy in, but you get more service out because it's warmer for longer. Then there's a question of how much do each of us demand. So we see this constant increase in the demand for energy consumption. So we've got this service demand per capita, and then it's multiplied by the number of citizens. So this kind of plays out at the national scale to really sort of say how we can think about the amount of energy we use. Now, you can start to break these things down. So the next step in the process, I'm going to take this first term, I'm going to start pulling it apart and tell you where people sit in this. Because at an economic level, this seems kind of all devoid of where people are. But when you think about it, okay, the way these things work is that the bottom part of the equation is always the same as the top of the next bit. So society permits different forms of energy system. Now, we saw this writ large after the Fukushima disaster, where we've seen the entire energy systems, not only of Japan, but of Germany, change as a result of the consequence of that. So really, society has to permit change. And we've seen this, in the case with the rollout of wind and solar in different parts of the world. Unless people are willing to permit these technologies in their own backyards, then we can't go down that route. So we've got a process of how we choose the systems. The next part of that is, okay, each system is a big and complex thing, but it's made up of decisions around what I'm going to buy. So again, we get back to this question of what do we as individuals choose to invest in, or we as companies choose to invest in. That's, again, there's a lot of human choice in there about these capital expenditures that we use. But then we sort of jump into the manufacturing side of this, because ultimately, somebody has to design these technologies. And so we sit down and we have what we call a design efficiency. And we've seen this in automotive sectors and in building sectors, where somebody comes up with a really, really efficient vehicle or efficient home. But the problem is that by the time you actually translate that design ideal into a manufactured product, we know they perform really, really differently. So you get this real breakdown between what they're designed to do and how they produce. And we've found situations with the production of gas boilers in the UK, where in fact, the manufacturers put their A-team onto the gas boilers that go off for testing. And they treat them like Formula One cars. They will tune them to the nth degree so these things perform perfectly. And then they will send them off to the people who certify this. And they will say, wow, this is a AAA rated boiler. But then what rolls off the end of the production line looks a bit more like this. It's full of holes and it doesn't really work anything like what was designed. And this is writ large in the building industry. I mean, there's this huge gap between the way we think buildings should perform on the drawing board and the way they actually perform by the time you've pulled together a whole lot of people who are on short-term kind of subcontracts who are quickly trying to put this thing together. So we've got this giant gap, which we often call the performance gap. And that's down again to people and the role of people within the sectors. The other thing that's really important, and this is an interesting one when it comes to the design process, is that we manufacture products with a mental image of the user in mind. So you cannot design a control system, you cannot design a car, you cannot design a building without some assumption about the people who are going to use that. And this is a problem because we tend not to go out and talk to these people. We don't do a lot of user-centered design. We end up just making assumptions. And this is an area that's coming in particularly that is very relevant to the work that's going on here at UNSW around social license to automate. The people who are doing this tend to be from a very narrow demographic. So we've seen a lot of issues here around sort of the lack of cultural diversity, the lack of gender diversity, the lack of sort of age diversity in the development of these products, and that is meaning that they don't assume a wide range of behavior. So we have to make these assumptions about these technologies behave. But the one thing we know is that people, when they get these technologies, they don't fit the really neat stereotypes that the designers have in mind. And so you end up jumping up and down and swearing and cursing because you simply can't get this piece of technology to do what you want it to do. And built environment is full of this. You know, I don't know how often you've tried to wrestle and get the air conditioning system in a building to work. We sit in an energy institute and we had a energy efficient retrofit, and one of my colleagues went round and talked to people about the controller, and in the entire building, which had about 150 people in it, only 2 people actually knew how to work the controller. But there was, and this is an energy institute focused on built environment, and they were people who had actually worked in the kind of sector and the design and specification. And we just go and push the off button. You know, it gets too cold, we push it off. We get too warm, we put it on. And you know, it's just, there is this just complete breakdown between this, you know, this imagined, very clever, interactive, intelligent user and the people that actually interact with these things. So this is a huge breakdown, and this is again where users come into it. And then you've got the relationship between the actual behavior and the amount of service you can get out of this. And I think my really key point here is that when we think about service, if we move to, say, the service sector, if you're not getting what you want, then you are getting bad service, basically. So if you cannot control your technologies to deliver what you're trying to do, then that is bad service. You're getting poor service out of the end of that. So for me, if we go back to this idea of energy, this is really energy efficiency. It's the same thing as energy intensity. Basically, if you can't get the service that you want as a consumer, that's an energy inefficient process. And so you have to have the user in the loop. They're as integral to delivering service and delivering efficiency as any other part of the process. And they're just not there at the moment. So we really struggle with this. So there's all these points where people come into the process. Okay, the next bit I want to talk about briefly is consumption intensity. And this is where we get onto a whole lot of other bits and pieces. So we design society, and society shapes the way we use energy. So everything from physical infrastructures like cycling lanes. If you don't have good cycling infrastructure, you're not going to get on your bike. And that's a real distinction between Northern European cities and many other parts of the world. So the physical infrastructure, the temporal infrastructure, how do we arrange things like work times and school times? That really dictates when we use energy. And there's all of these others, social structures around social norms, cultural expectations, social practices. These things lock us into various patterns of energy behavior. And this comes down to the structure of legal limits and economic structures. So all of these things determine our energy use. So you can really see this energy transition is quite a challenging thing. It's not just within the energy sector. It spills over into all lots of other sectors of society because energy is really pervasive. So that's kind of showing a little bit about why I think we really have to get the user piece right. Otherwise, we're just not going to get anywhere with this. But I also want to throw in some of the major challenges that this sector is facing globally. So one of these is recruiting and retaining talent. I'll talk a bit more about this, but I think we're at a crunch point in our sector more broadly, and it's not just this sector, but it occurs across the whole sort of infrastructure and built environment area. We have to think about how we want to construct our system in terms of how distributed it is. And I'll talk about something that's very seldom talked about, is distributed governance. Who is going to actually have the final say? If we're pushing all of this infrastructure out into people's backyards, then is it reasonable to presume they have no control and no say over how things are governed? And I'll talk a bit about how we construct consumer engagement. And there's a big thing, there's a big cultural clash coming in here. So these are kind of tearing the industry apart at the moment. And that's not only the energy industry, but as it details into infrastructure and built environment as well. So the first one on recruitment and retention of talent. We've seen in Europe big companies like Statoil basically rebrand themselves to be Equinor precisely because they cannot recruit and retain talent. So this is hitting the big petro sectors very hard, but also it's coming into areas of the rest of the energy industry as well. And I suppose my challenge is, here we have school climate strikes, and I think there's a real question about, in this sector, how socially progressive or regressive we are. Now, if I was an employer, I would absolutely love these people to be working for my company. Okay, these are the most motivated, the best and brightest students that are coming through. And look at the gender balance, look at the kind of motivation and the determination. And we really should be in a position where these people are saying, if I want to tackle climate change, there is no sector better than the energy and built environment sector to be tackling these issues. Okay, they should be coming and knocking on our doors. They are making decisions about their subjects right now as to where they're going to go in their careers. In 2 or 3 years' time, they'll be in university courses. In 5 years' time, they're graduating. These are the people that will really solve this problem for us. They should be looking at our sector, and we have to really think about whether they are or not. I think they are in some parts of it. It's a really it's really dichotomizing the sector, because in some areas, the kind of IT, the renewables, they're really coming into those sectors, but they're avoiding the traditional parts of the industry, and that's causing this bifurcation. And we need to be really aware of how this plays out. This is a big issue for the industry over the next decade or so. Another really big issue I've mentioned is this one around how much we distribute the energy system out into the environment. So, here we've got a nice, I think this is from sort of Southern Europe somewhere, or sorry, no, actually Northern Europe, part of Germany. But we're seeing a lot of integration of PV, and that's certainly the case in Australia. But I think the interesting thing here is there is something about decentralizing which kicks off an entire dynamic that we are now locked into. So we've decided we want to decarbonize our energy system, but we've decided we want to do that with very low energy density generation sources. Compared with nuclear or fossil fuels, you need a lot of land space to put in PV and wind generation. So you do that, and you end up with this, by definition, as soon as you decarbonize, you end up with this distributed energy system. That's a problem, because all of a sudden your generation is all floating out around the edges of your grid, and you're needing to pump energy in two directions. To do that, you need to overlay a level of digital technologies, and this we kind of loosely call the smart grid. And that has big implications as well, which we'll come to. So we're now ending up with investing more in our distribution and transmission systems than we are in most other parts of it. We're spending more on digitalizing our grids than we are on gas-fired power stations anymore. So it's a real transition, and soon in most countries, the grid is going to be the single most expensive bit of the infrastructure. But the other thing that happens here is we are basically asking people to give us their energy. We're effectively appropriating their resources. We want them to give us their solar and their wind. But we also want them to put big batteries in and around their properties. And we want them to engage with us so that we can use their data from digitalization to control when they use energy. So we want to automate all this. This is a big ask, okay? This is a really different kettle of fish to what we've had previously. So you do this, and all of a sudden, people are going to reasonably expect that they have an investment and a role. It's like the planning process. We now accept that the planning process has to be one in which local people have a say. And that will be the same with the energy system. So we need to think about distributed governance. And that flows out of as soon as you decarbonize. The other thing you have to do, which is kind of interesting and a bit scary for the sector, is that if you want to buy and sell large numbers of small amounts of energy going every which way across your grid, then you can't afford to have big companies in the middle taking a skim off that every time you do it. So you have to do what we call disintermediate, and this is language that comes out of another sector which is around distributed ledgers. But essentially what you need to do is make it incredibly cheap to buy and sell small amounts of energy. Otherwise the whole thing just grinds to a halt and it's just not worth doing. So you end up changing the business structure of the sector, and you need automation, and you need to automate the contracts and buys and sells for all of that to work. But something else really interesting starts to happen here as well, because you're starting to distribute your energy system and you're starting to democratize it, and you've got a nice digital layer. Energy is no longer what it was. So traditionally it's been a homogeneous good, and I'll talk a bit about that. It basically means it doesn't matter who you buy your energy from, it's all exactly the same, and you just go with whoever is the cheapest dealer. But now that starts to fall apart, because now you can buy energy from your local community. That's an interesting idea. We'll talk some more about that, because then you start to get a social overlay. So you get social energy and social relationships coming in there. And people are interested in being able to trade energy with their school or with their church. That has meaning and value to them. So they can start to get multiple forms of value that come in there. And that actually helps, because now we're able to stack up multiple forms of value, and that creates an incentive for people to invest in decarbonisation in the first place. So it's an interesting and complicated loop that we're going round, but it actually has some positives in there as well. So the third theme, I'm just going to keep a weather eye on the time, is this question of effectively how do we construct value for people? So what we have done historically is we've in the whole sector, we've done something called cost engineering. So this goes right the way back to the 70s and the oil shocks and the way the big global or local energy planning for the International Energy Agency still works. We try to do what's called whole energy system cost minimization under carbon constraints. So it's a fancy way of saying we think basically that we want to get their energy is all exactly the same. So what you need to do is work out how to drive down costs as much as possible so people get the cheapest energy. And that's this kind of cost engineering approach. It's always, the product is identical, so you drive down the costs. That has some interesting implications, by the way. So basically, if you do that, then there's no logical reason why any of us should be wanting to have more than one energy supplier at once, because what they're providing is absolutely identical. But if all of a sudden you're getting energy with different values, you might want to have multiple providers. And that's an interesting thing, and we're going in that direction in the UK, actually. But the other thing is, this is an engineering and a kind of energy system view, but that is colliding head-on with the views of the ICT sector. So if you talk about people coming in from ICT, they're all about value engineering. Basically, you think about your phone. That's the most ridiculously expensive telephone you've probably ever owned in your life. But I bet you all have one, and you bet you all probably think it's quite good value because you can do 1,001 things on that phone. And that's about this process of constantly working out how to add value to people as you go through the process. And value engineering is what ICT and fintech and other elements do really, really well. But that's a completely different culture to what we've done. So we've got these two cultures just clashing, and I keep running into this. I keep talking with really interesting, innovative startups in this space, and they're pulling their hair out because they just don't understand how the energy sector works. It drives them completely mad. And the energy sector is just really scared of all these startups because they want to tear everything up and move it around. So it's interesting. Actually, there's a classic example of this because there's a famous quote, I think, by Mark Zuckerberg, who said, move fast and break things. And a colleague of mine from EDF, R&D, and EDF builds massive nuclear plants. So he had this wonderful thing of this huge crane delicately lifting a nuclear fuel rod out of a reactor. And then it had on top, move fast and break things. So you kind of get a sense of this clash between the sectors. There are some things you don't want to move fast and break. So that really tickled me. So what we really need to do is think about how do we bring these sectors together to actually start to create value for end consumers? Because we hear a lot about how people are really disengaged with this sector. So to do that, we need to step out of your classical economic thinking, which is really just around who's the cheapest price. And we need to move into identifying these kind of social and psychological and financial values. And this is what we call social value stacking. How do we create a lot of different value for people in this process? And I think this is an interesting area at the moment because the data and the digital layer comes into that. But it has some challenges as well. So the other thing that's interesting in here is this what we call the double dividend. Because what we've found, especially early on, is if you start doing things like giving people photovoltaics, then they start to get interested in energy. We often talk about this thing called the attitude-behavior link, where you need to change people's attitudes to the environment, and then they will go out and buy photovoltaics and things like that. Interestingly, it works the other way around. If you can change people's behavior, they will change their attitude to match their behavior. So if you can get them a PV system, they'll start going, ooh, I'm really interested in this energy stuff. And they'll start to think, oh, actually, I'm quite green, aren't I? Right, okay, I'm a greenie now, so I'm going to start managing my own energy, and that electric vehicle could be really interesting. I'm starting to get this thing. So you can change behavior to change people's attitudes, and that's a direction of travel we don't engage with all that much. But I think it's a really powerful one to look at. And so this idea of a double dividend, where you give people some energy they need to manage, and then it's real for them, and they start to then engage in other ways of saving energy in their system. Okay, so now we're going to jump slightly sideways here, and I want to throw some of the risks. There's a couple of sort of big issues in here that are really challenging the world. And this gets kind of a bit economicsy, but it's not too bad to think through. But this dawned on me at a presentation only about sort of 18 months ago, and it's worth conveying. So currently, our world, historically in the energy sector, we have done things that basically things have not cost that much to build, but they've cost a huge amount to run. So basically, if you're building a coal-fired power station or a gas-fired power station, okay, they're big bits of kit, but then you've got to constantly feed them with a lot of gas or coal, and that costs a lot of money. But if you're now building lots of wind farms and PV, then they cost a lot to build, but they cost nothing to run, basically. So we're moving from a system where the costs are all in the fixed capital formation, and that's in generation and the grid, and it costs very, very little to actually run the system. Now, okay, let's see if I can walk you through some economics. Currently, when you pay for energy, I'm assuming you pay per kilowatt hour. So effectively, often on your bill, you'll have a bit of a standing charge, which is about kind of a network charge, and then you pay per kilowatt hour, okay? That's the old world. That worked well when we had lots of kind of things that took a lot to run. But now we're moving to a world where basically all the costs are up front. And so you get a lot of sort of capital cost, but then after that, how much you use per unit is relatively cheap. So the big thing we're grappling with is there's a really interesting inequity here. There's a point where these two lines cross. Now, if you go and get solar and a battery, then you're not buying energy from the grid anymore. You're using a lot of your own. So if you happen to have a nice amount of money, you can go and do that stuff. But then, in fact, you're paying less than you should for this high capital cost infrastructure. But if you can't afford PV or battery, which is often people who have less money, then in fact, you're paying more than you should. So we've got a situation emerging now where the poor are cross-subsidizing the rich, purely because we pay per kilowatt hour as a basis. And this thing, how we socialize the cost of the network, this is the thing that's keeping policymakers awake at night. Because currently we have this big social inequity that is emerging because of the way the grid is changing. And we need to address that. So there's some real challenges here about social equity within these systems. So the next one is this question, okay, in order to solve some of these problems, we need to construct this social value. And so we know that consumers are really disengaged with energy at present. And in fact, it was only recently somebody was explaining that if you were to design a system to make it as disengaging as humanly possible, it would look like the energy system, basically. That's how you would, if you really set out that, because your bills arrive miles late, you've got no idea what they relate to, you can't see this energy stuff, you don't care about it. What you care about is being warm and having food and having light and everything. So it's really designed to disengage. And this is one thing we have to really, really tackle. And I think we can do this by starting to change the debate around this. So we need to think about things that energy provides that people want. And this is this shift towards services. Another distinction here is, okay, at one stage I was going through and working out why are we in such a mess in this sector? And partly, these are the things, these are the people that form the energy sector that we all, for those of you who are engaged in energy, you'll recognize all of these kind of institutions and what their agendas are. So they're all interested in slightly different things, which is a problem. So some are interested in price, some are interested in carbon emissions, some are interested in power. Energy and power are slightly different. Consumers don't care about any of that stuff, to be really honest. I mean, they're interested in comfort and convenience and health and social acceptability and risk, and there is money. Money is certainly a factor. environmental factors. But there is this huge disconnect between what the industry is jumping up and down and saying we have to focus on and what people are actually interested in. And we've got to turn this around. And about 10 years ago, I was on a train down to a European Horizon-funded project in southern Europe. And I started to think about this, and I started to think, well, this is really odd. There are things that you could provide that would really engage people. And I was starting to write these out, and I thought, why isn't the industry thinking like this? So some of these we have now. I mean, we've now got systems where basically your heating system knows when you're on the way home, so it kind of prepares your home for you. That's nice. A user would like that. There are some things now where people are starting in the startup sector to provide things like, we can maintain a security presence in your home by basically using lighting to suggest you're actually in presence at your home. So it's starting to mimic some of your regular patterns because we can learn that kind of stuff. That's a value to people. Things like pre-chilling your supermarket because you're basically from your smartphone and app that you're about to get a delivery, so you want to drive down the energy in your fridge. There are some things, and you might see where we're going with some of this. If you're active in your home and you have a Fitbit, you might want to have turned down your air conditioning when you're starting to get more active. That would be nice, wouldn't it? So we could do things like that. The one I like, because I do this just to really annoy all my colleagues in government, there are things like, I came up with this one called Healthy Home. So often in the UK, we suffer from things like mold and dust mites. But if you give me control over your air conditioning system, I can basically kill the dust mites in your home while you're on holiday. Wow, I can do a home sanitation exercise. I have to drive down the relative humidity and change the temperature, but you're not going to be in there, so you don't really mind. You're off on holiday for a week somewhere else. And when you come back, all those kind of creepy crawlies are dead because they didn't like the environment I created. Would you buy that? I can know a lot of middle-class people in London that would buy that in a flash. So that's a kind of, there are some things that we can do that really put the consumer at the heart of it. But I hope some of you are getting a little bit worried at this stage because these things don't necessarily save energy. So we've got to be a bit careful here. The other part of this jigsaw puzzle is this. There are some technologies emerging. I don't know how many are familiar with something called non-intrusive load monitoring. But I'm working with a company in the UK that can actually tell you when your washing machine filter is clogged and when you need to change that. They can tell you beforehand that your appliances are about to fail because they're changing the way they use energy. That's interesting. Now that means they can aggregate that up and potentially sell it back to the washing machine manufacturers. And they can also feed that back into other things like making sure you're not doing a distressed purchase. They can do things like hazard reduction, so they can tell you when you've left an appliance on which is a fire hazard risk, and you can switch it off automatically. This is the kind of approaches that really start with what people want and engage them. Gets a bit spooky at some point. So MIT have actually done work that they can work out what television station you're watching or what internet you're browsing just by looking at your energy. Yeah, where do we draw the line on this one? And this is another big hypothesis for the sector, which is, okay, so at some point, the value of particularly your electricity data, your electricity as an information vector starts to become really, really valuable. And there's lots of companies out there that would really like very detailed information on how you use electricity, because they can start doing some clever things. So I think, and this is where we get into spooky territory, the last great area for targeted advertising is inside the home. Imagine if people knew what you were doing when inside your home, and they could send you advertising when you're brushing your teeth or when you're sitting on the loo. They could actually know that about you and send you things. Wouldn't that be brilliant? They could give you all these services you want just at that point in time. And I think this is a future that is not out of the question, but it does interesting thing for the sector, because if all of a sudden you start making lots of money on data, you can start undercutting your costs on energy, cross-subsidization. So we might see energy prices driven down because the data is so valuable. And people would buy into that, possibly. We've seen them buy into it in a lot of other areas. And that turns us into this kind of what I call the dystopian turn, this idea of what we've seen coming out as kind of surveillance capitalism, where people are predicting what you're going to do and hitting you with advertising at exactly the right time. So this is the area I think we could go down this route. Interesting. How many people would like that? Could be very profitable. If I was doing a startup, I would be seriously thinking about this. All you students out there, take note. There's money in here. But it's a scary world. The utopian turn, by contrast, is where we kind of start to go back to questions about looking at the value of energy in society and doing social value stacking. And there's a lot of evidence around how we can start to build out, through local energy systems, values for community. And that comes in with things like skills and education and training and keeping money within that community. And it provides, collaboration, is support for collaboration, economy missions and things. So you can do a lot of stuff. You can start to get supermarkets buying from schools and using that as part of their local society. So there is value in this version of the future, I think. And we did a very interesting piece of work that completely surprised. Not often you do. This was a colleague of mine, PhD student, who's just finished this. So this was presented, I think, to our regulator last week. But we're really interested in what happens if you can have more than one energy supplier. So we asked people whether they would be interested in having a national supplier and a local supplier. And I've never seen results this strong in my life. So this was a national scale survey. And we said, we are going to give you both a national and local supplier. Would you like that? And absolutely overwhelming people said, yes, we would love to have a local energy supplier that provides energy from local resources where they're available, and when they're not available, it goes back to a national supplier. And then we said, well, we are going to force you to choose. We're not going to tell you whether you start with a local or a national supplier. You have to choose. Which would you choose? People said, we want to choose a combination of both a national and a local supplier, and overwhelmingly so. So we ended up in a situation where now there is this latent demand for people having multiple suppliers providing multiple different sources of social value. That's a challenge, and we're looking at this in the UK in detail, but it completely changes the logic. The other thing we said, well, and this is a really weird one, you keep getting these contradictory results, is who would you want to approach you first? Would you like to be approached by a local supplier and have a national supplier bolted on, or approached by your national supplier and have a local supplier bolted on? And overwhelmingly, people said, we want to be approached by basically we want to have our national supplier bolt on a local supplier. That tells me they're trusting their national supplier, which is kind of not what we were expecting at all. So some really interesting dynamics in this space, but an overwhelming desire to have local energy providers. I'm conscious I need to wrap up fairly soon. So I want to run through a couple of projects that we're involved with, because I think they also illustrate what we're trying to do in this technology collaboration program. So this is a project which is in social housing in London, where we've got a social block with 37 kilowatts of PV on the roof. Now currently that PV is pumped out into the network and they get paid 4 pence per kilowatt hour. But all the people living in the social housing are paying 14 pence per kilowatt hour for their energy. That kind of seems a bit rough, basically. So what we're doing is setting up a situation where people in the housing block can consume the energy off the roof. and they can also look to trade that internally. So this is about peer-to-peer trading, but it's also about how you engage a hard-to-reach group of consumers in terms of social housing. And it's also about how you construct a value proposition which will allow you to automate their energy use. So it's about this social license to automate. And it's about the business models that make this work. So this touches on all of the work that this TCP is doing. Yeah, so this is the kind of community area. I think the PV is, I think, either on that block up there or one very close by. So we're setting something up where they can save on their energy bills. They're getting something somewhere between they have to pay less than the 14p they have been doing, but more than the 4p that they would get. And it brings these kind of wider social benefits. And so we're really interested in how you reconstruct energy into this social dimension to engage people and also save them money. The next one is one we're doing in Colombia, which is a lovely project which we're just kicking off. And this is basically in Comuna 13, which is famous, where the FARC and the ELN were coming into the city of Midian, and there was a lot of drug cartels and others in there. And there was a horrible stage about 5 years ago when they just locked down the entire area, sent in militia, not even paid military forces, but militia. They flew over there with helicopter gunships, and it was a complete lockdown war zone for a while. But now we're in a situation where we can go in there working with our local colleagues and think about setting up energy trading within this area. So the interesting thing here is that the lower socioeconomic strata, they are on these hillsides. So I've got some pictures. Yeah, so they're scattered all up and down these hills, but they have great solar access on their roof. Okay, so you can see all these rooftop areas get a lot of sun because they're all on the hillside. But the people who are in the posh parts of town are all in very high-rise buildings, so they've got no roof space whatsoever. So we're setting it up so basically you can put in PV and battery storage on these more informal settlements and sell it to the people in the high-rise. But the other thing is they've got a social structure for their energy pricing. So if you are in these lower strata, you're actually cross-subsidized. You pay less for your energy, and the people in higher social strata pay more. And everybody in Midian thinks that's a really good idea. They genuinely like this. And by the way, they really like their energy company. It's owned by the city council, and it is one of the most popular energy companies in South America. So when the energy company comes in and says, would you mind if we set this up? They go, hey, we trust you guys. You guys are really good. You're part of our community. And this sounds like a really sensible thing because everybody's bought into this social strata side of it. So things can work. There are areas where you can get some really interesting rays of hope. And this is just a shot of the building. My colleague Alexandra is hiding up the back somewhere. There she is, right? We were both out there. Yeah, and so this was the social center where we're going to be installing the PV. And this is just a kind of overview of the space. So yeah, really interesting. There are ways in which we can take this transition in a way that really works for people. So looping back, just to finish off, this technology collaboration program, it sits under the auspices of the International Energy Agency. And we're interested in exploring this whole space of area about how the energy transition, we can use that to re-engineer this relationship between people and energy and the built environment. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity to do this, and it's through these comparisons between comparing what's happening in Colombia and Australia and in parts of Europe that you get to see what the possibilities are and just the different ways in which energy plays out around the world. So it's a really interesting platform. We have these different annexes that are set up already. So we have one on business models and systems, which is really looking at how we create service-based offerings for people, which are much more consumer-focused. We've got one on these hard-to-reach energy users. So how do you access that 30% of the market that is really difficult to engage? They're going to be crucial. We cannot decarbonize without engaging the whole sector. We've got one on peer-to-peer energy trading. So that's this idea of looking at this local trading of energy and how we stack value within that. And then the one that UNSW is integral to, which is this social license to automate. And that's about just making sure that we take people with us on this journey. Good? And I think that's it. Apologies. I slightly overran. Whoops, I'll go back to my cat. How's that? We can finish on the cat. There we are. This is my archetypal user.